Hi everyone, Nick the Record Lover here. Welcome to my channel, Nick the Record Lover here on YouTube. Great to see everybody. It's December 3rd, 2022. It's Saturday night. It's great to be with all of you. And December 3rd, 1965 marks a very important time in rock and roll history. It was the release date of the Beatles' Rubber Soul in the United Kingdom. Okay, this here is a mono copy that I dug out of the 2014 Beatles and Mono box set, which is out of print now. I was glad that I look back that I did get it for Christmas that year. And this is the mono copy, PMC 1267. It's actually like a reproduction of the 1965 mono copy in the UK. And here is a stereo copy that I bought separately that was in the stereo box set that came out. And this was recorded digitally. So this and the CD that came out in the from the UK stereo box have the same master tapes, but this sounds really good on vinyl as well. Uh, Soul made such an impact on people such as Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, and there's a person on Facebook that writes a article or a post. It's called "The Beach Boys and Beatles and the Beach Boys 101." And it's everything you've ever wanted to know about the Beatles and the Beach Boys, or were afraid to ask, something like that. But it really is a nice post that the gentleman puts on, and you learn different things each day, and about all the Beatles and Beach Boys releases that happened, and who influenced who, and things like that. Um, the question is, and I've read this many, many a time about Rubber Soul, is what version do you prefer? Do you, the Beatles fan, prefer? Do you like the American version, which came out December 5th, 1965, which is a stereo copy right here, an original 1965 stereo? This has new improved full dimensional stereo on the white banner with the Capitol logo. Most of the new improved full dimensional stereo copies that came out had new improved full dimensional stereo in brown in a long oval. So that's how you would know it was in stereo. And this is an original stereo copy because it says this stereo record should be played only with a stereo cartridge and needle to avoid damage. Later copies of Rubber Soul on Capitol Records did not have that. This is a sealed Rubber Soul in stereo that was given to me for my 30th birthday as a birthday gift. Sealed, and it has a Two Guys 597 sticker on it. And here is the new improved full dimensional stereo written in brown. And here's the white banner. And the picture is a little bit over the catalog number ST2442. So for how many years? I think for the past 20, 22, almost 23 years, I've been trying to figure out if this is an Apple copy, if this could be a late 60s rainbow label, could it be a green label, could it be a red label, could it be orange, could it be an early 1968 Apple copy with manufactured by Capitol Records on the Apple on the sliced Apple side, or could this be a 1971 Apple Records? Being that it was 597 in stereo, and it doesn't have the disclaimer to only play it on a stereo phonograph, I would think this got to be later than 1965, and even later than 66 or 67 because they stopped after 1967 making mono copies of Rubber Soul. So this is a stereo one, and I would think it might be Apple, but this is very rare to have. So to this day and days after, I won't be opening it. So you'll have to decide for yourselves what that might be, and so will I. But the question is, getting back to it, is what is your favorite version of the album? Is it the American version with the 12 tracks, or is it the UK version with the 14 songs, with the three songs that were not on the American copy? Now, the American copy I grew up with. I won a copy of this on the radio in 1983 off of radio station WPST. I was caller number 9, and I actually won a copy off the radio, but it was a purple label. It was a reissue, and it had promotional use, not for sale, stamped over here in the upper right hand corner. But I played that to shreds, and I had traded it in to a local record store after a while. But maybe later down the line, I'll probably find another purple label. But this here is a 1965 original, and it has the rainbow label. There it is. It just says Rubber Soul, the Beatles, and it has their four names on it. And other copies that had the new improved full dimensional stereo banners, this banner is pretty thick as opposed to the other ones I have. Some copies that have this new improved full dimensional stereo up here can also have Apple labels, like from 1968 or 1971. Because in 1968, Apple started to take over because the Beatles started Apple in 1968. So even though it had a capital cover, it had an Apple record inside, and the 1968 copies would say manufactured by Capitol Records Incorporated, a subsidiary of Capitol Industries, on the slice side of the Apple label. Now, if you bought a 1971 Apple copy, it would say manufactured by Apple Records on the whole Apple side, the Granny Smith Apple. So, which one is better? Is it the UK or is it the United States? Now, like I said, I've seen this debate all over social media when it comes to the Beatles and their UK versions and the United States versions. As an American citizen, I only knew about the Capitol releases. I didn't know about the UK releases until 1983 when I went to a place called Record Town in Woodbridge Mall, and they had all of these albums. They had Beatles for Sale. They had Twist and Shout Beatlemania with the Beatles, a Canadian copy. They had Please Please Me with the Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, but with a different cover. It wasn't the red, it was like all different pictures. It was all blue, and it had only Beatles songs on it. Same with Help, it had only Beatles songs on it. But I heard a complete broadcast in 1983 over a few days of the Beatles, the days in their life. They played all of the Christmas messages, they played all of the singles, and they played each and every track from all of the British albums from 1963 to 1970. And I was floored. I said to myself, especially with Rubber Soul, I heard Nowhere Man, and I said, Nowhere Man's not on Rubber Soul. How is Nowhere Man on Rubber Soul? I don't have it on my copy. And then I realized that they were talking about the original UK British releases that had more songs, and then Capitol Records would chop off some to make different albums. For instance, like Meet the Beatles was almost with the Beatles, only with the Beatles didn't have I Want to Hold Your Hand on it. Um, with the Beatles had Money That's What I Want, and the Beatles' second album had Money That's What I Want. So, what songs that were already a year old were like first heard in America in 1964. Now, Rubber Soul, I remember hearing this, listening to it, the copy that I want on the radio, and hearing it at Christmas time because the album came out in December. And it also kind of has a Christmas kind of feel to it, or a winterish kind of a winter kind of feel to the album. Maybe even fall, early winter, midwinter kind of album kind of feel to it. And the American copy starts off with "I've Just Seen a Face." And has Norwegian Wood, You Won't See Me, Think for Yourself, The Word, and Me Shall. Now, what was left off of side one was Nowhere Man. And it also started off with Drive My Car, like the mono copy here in the UK. And the UK version has Nowhere Man, and it also has What Goes On, and one of George's best songs that he wrote with the Beatles of all time, If I Needed Someone. Now, I remember hearing that on the radio, and I'm saying to myself, If I Needed Someone is on this. I have If I Needed Someone. That's on Yesterday and Today. I said, how could that be on Rubber Soul? I don't have that. It's not on here. I only have 12 songs. But then it was years later that I wound up getting the Beatles CDs in 1987, and they did start with the UK releases. Everything was the UK lineup. They did release Magical Mystery Tour, even though it wasn't released as an album in Britain. It was released as an EP. But then almost 10 years later, they would release the album version in England with the booklet. But the American copy that came out December 5th, 1965, I grew up listening to. So the argument that people make is that the Americans were shortchanged. Uh, it's terrible compared to the UK copy. That never went through my mind at all. If it did, I probably wouldn't even have the American copies. So, you know, I like, I very much like the UK version of it. I like the idea that it has 14 songs, and I like the stereo copy. I like the stereo copy and the mono copy. I like the mono mix, but the stereo mix in the United States only has the full start twice on "I'm Looking Through You" in in stereo only. The stereo CDs, the stereo the the stereo CD, I believe, in the U.S. the capital years has the full starts, but every mono mix, capital and the UK have the complete song with no full starts in the acoustic guitar. In fact, only the mono and the stereo in the UK has it corrected. Because when I first heard the UK version of Rubber Soul, I got it for Christmas in 1987. They didn't have the full start. I was waiting for the full start, but it just started off regular, and I was like, wow, there was no full start. That was only available on the stereo copy in America and in the mono copy on both the United States and the UK. During Norwegian Wood, it's after one of the verses. She asked me to stay and she told me to sit anywhere. The music goes by, but then you hear somebody sneezing in the mono copy. If you really listen hard enough, you can hear somebody sneezing. Stereo copy, that was cleaned up. It's not there. And on the mono mix of both the American and the UK, it has the sneeze. So, but I think that as a folk album, if you're going for a folk rock release, which is what music was starting to turn into in mid late 1965, I think this is the LP. This is the Rubber Soul. That does it edge out the UK? I think it's apples and oranges. I don't think one's better than the other. I really enjoy the fact that Nowhere Man was part of this album, and If I Needed Someone was part of the UK copy, and What Goes On. Although I think It's Only Love is a stronger side too, and I also think that I've Just Seen a Face. Both acoustic tracks, make up for that folk rock feel. I mean, Bob Dylan even went to the Beatles when they released Rubber Soul, and he said, "I get it. You don't want to be cute anymore." And really, when I read a book called Growing Up with the Beatles, it was by Ron Schoenberg, and it was an excellent book. And once he saw the cover of the new album Rubber Soul, how they're looking, or shall I say, not looking at the camera. Excuse me. This was a straight picture. This was not originally like this. The picture was really like straight horizontally. And what happened was Robert Freeman put the picture on a chair, and the Beatles were looking at it, and it was a straight picture. The picture itself moved a little bit, and it looked like this. And they said, "Can we use that shot?" And that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. And if you look at it, barely John Lennon is looking at the camera. I mean, one eye is looking at you, and the other eye is looking in a different direction. Paul is looking. They don't look happy on this album cover. Let's put it that way. That kind of started though with Beatles for Sale, because they looked, even though it was in the midst of Beatlemania, they looked exhausted, and that's for another video. But and their hair is way below their ears here. There's no mop tops in this picture. And when Ron Schoenberg looked at this cover, it didn't really affect me that way until I not affect me, but I didn't think of it that way until I read Ron Schoenberg's book that George is looking the other way like he doesn't like not that he doesn't want to be there, but it's like he's thinking of something else. Ringo was just looking around. Paul is doing the same, and John is like, okay, maybe, looking at the camera like, okay, this is another photo shoot. But Ron Schoenberg said he looked at the cover in 1965 and he said, I was appalled. I'm sorry, I don't like the cover. He said it wasn't the music that was on it, it wasn't the font of Rubber Soul. Now, Rubber Soul, just I digress a bit. Rubber Soul was a pun or was a play on Plastic Soul, which is what the black artists were calling the white artists that were singing R&B, like the Rolling Stones. They were calling Mick Jagger Plastic Soul when they were doing R&B and black music. And then, Paul McCartney was doing Long Tall Sally, and the Beatles were doing I'm Down, which was a tribute to Little Richard. And the black artists were calling the white um, British artists Plastic Soul. Like it really wasn't soul. It was just white guys trying to sing black music or black, R&B. And Rubber Soul, it was a pun. It was Rubber Soul, like you could almost think of it as the shoe, or Rubber Soul as in soul, which I thought was, how clever can you get? And Ron Schoberg said, "I'm sorry." He said it wasn't the music, it wasn't it wasn't the font of Rubber Soul, it was the faces. The Beatles looked old. He said for a while they were quote one of us, innocent, young, carefree, just wanting to make music, wanting to rock and roll. But here it was like we're serious now. This is a real album. Not that the other albums weren't real; they were very real. But this was, we're not 22 years old anymore and jumping up in the air on our album covers or anything like that. I mean, even look at the back cover. You see Paul McCartney with a cigarette in his mouth. You know, Whereas on the "I Want to Hold Your Hand" picture sleeve, he has a cigarette sticking out of his hand, sticking out of his fingers, and one between his fingers. But here he's actually smoking one. So it was like, and not even smiling here. They're looking at the camera, but it's just them as four individuals. And he said he was through at that point. He said with the Beatles at that time in 1965. He didn't rediscover the group until 1967. He said he completely banished the Beatles from his brain between 65 and 67. I have a friend whose father bought Rubber Soul in 1965, listened to it, this version, listened to it, actually got scared of it, didn't know what to make of it, and he put it away and didn't listen to it until 1968 when he was ready to hear the Beatles' new music, as another friend of the family once described this to me. They were making new music. That's what they were calling Rubber Soul. That's what they were calling Revolver. The Beatles were creating new music, music that nobody was doing up until this point. They were using the sitar on Norwegian Wood. George Harrison started getting influenced by the sitar, hearing the name Ravi Shankar. But in the film Help, you could see him going and looking in a sitar shop, and actually he went to buy a cheap sitar in a shop in England. It wasn't like a state of the art sitar, but they did use it. But he did use it like as a guitar, like a rock and roll instrument. He wasn't playing like Indian music on it, but he was just giving it that kind of a feel. And they were using things called a fuzz bass, a harmonium. Uh, but for the songs, I love all the songs. I mean, it's the Beatles, but it's a completely different Beatles. I mean, they evolved every year when they did something. It was like if they did Rubber Soul, they weren't copying Beatles '65 or Beatles for Sale or A Hard Day's Night. they were evolving with each individual album, and I think that that's what started with this. And Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, this influenced him to do Pet Sounds. The Beach Boys do Pet Sounds because he said the Beatles' Rubber Soul was a whole album, and he quotes, with all good stuff. And he thought it was like a religious experience the first time he heard it. But it was the American copy, they say, not the British copy. Nobody really knows anyway. They never asked him. So, but he even said it was a religious experience, and he said that it got him into doing the Pet Sounds album. He's like, I'm going to write a whole album, the best rock and roll album ever made after this. So, and Pet Sounds, of course, in its own right is another discussion for another day. But I do enjoy the American version. Can I say a little bit more than the UK? I enjoy both equally, but I think Drive My Car was going more for an R&B style with Rubber Soul than if you have I've Just Seen a Face and It's Only Love. But I still think it's apples and oranges. I don't think that there is a right way or a wrong way to listen to Rubber Soul or Revolver. I mean, we as an American citizens got these records. You know, the Beatles' second album, Meet the Beatles, Something New, A Hard Day's Night, but we got it with the incidental uh, soundtrack music from George Martin. Same thing with the Help album. We got some tracks from the Beatles and some tracks from George Martin. And there's been many a discussion on this on YouTube about how Capitol Records destroyed the Revolver album. And they're saying that now. And it's, there are people like that make videos from Britain. And I see their point, but I don't see it as they destroyed the Beatles albums or butchered them. And the Yesterday and Today butcher cover has nothing to do with the idea of Capitol butchering the American albums, or sorry, butchering the British albums to make the American ones. The Beatles were making a statement about Vietnam with that cover. It's been known for a while now that that's what they were doing with the baby dolls and with the cigarette burns all over them and the shot shards of meat all over them. That it was a satire on Vietnam, that they were killing little babies in Vietnam, and they were just like going with the stuff all over them. And it was more of a dark joke. I mean, but that's another one. Maybe if I get a butcher cover, we'll have that for another discussion. Uh, but there's a new book coming out from Bruce Spicer, and I might be getting it for Christmas this year, where he talks about Rubber Soul, Yesterday and Today, and Revolver. And I believe he talks about the capital issues in it. Um, and I think that that's going to be a great book because I love Bruce Spicer's books. Um, everything is great. The U.S. Capitol albums I have, and I have the Beatles solo on Apple Records, and I have the White Album and the Story of Apple Records. I have the Abbey Road. I have Get Back to Let It Be, uh, or Get Back to Abbey Road, and the Beatles Finally Let It Be. Bruce Spicer makes excellent books, and I guarantee, and I take it from me. I mean, you'll have a great time reading his books, no matter what. If it's the VJ, you can find the VJ albums that he wrote about. I don't have that one. That's pretty rare now, but he's excellent, and I really love him as an author, a Beatles author, because he's really got it. But I'll have to say that I enjoyed this one because I grew up with it. But I also grew up listening to this one on the radio, and then, like I said, I went to Record Town and saw this. But there's been so much of a debate, I can't get enough of it, that they say that Capitol Records destroyed the Beatle albums that were released in England. And it didn't start to become the same until Sergeant Pepper's. But if you think about Sergeant Pepper's, the Sergeant Pepper in the UK at the end of A Day in the Life had a frequency noise that only dogs could hear. And after that, the Sergeant Pepper inner groove that kept going around and around and around, all of gibberish to gibberish to gibberish. Now, the United States copy did not have either one of those things after A Day in the Life. It was the final piano chord, it faded, and that was it. And you heard the squeaky chair at the end. We didn't get Sergeant Pepper Inner Groove until the Rarities album. And we didn't get the high frequency noise for only dogs until the first issue of the Sergeant Pepper CD in 1987. And I remember hearing that. You can hear a little bit of it. You go like that, and then you hear the Sergeant Pepper's intergroove after that. It only runs once on the Rarities album. It doesn't keep going like it's the end of the record like that. But really, was it really the first album that was the same as America? If you want to be technical, it's not. But the White Album was, and maybe that was the first one that was. So that's something else to think about. But did Capitol Records butcher their albums? Absolutely not, because American citizens, other people have said, like on YouTube or social media, the American citizens didn't know anything about those releases. They started releasing imports in the late 60s in the United States. There was actually a picture I saw online of a record store in 1971 out in maybe Kansas or Illinois, and someone took a picture of the record department, and it was 1971, and they had With the Beatles, the UK version of Meet the Beatles, or actually the Meet the Beatles is the American version of With the Beatles, in the rack right in the front. And I'm saying to myself, in 1971 we had imports here, but they said even earlier than that there were the imported copies in the late 60s in the United States. So my question is what do you think? Do you like Rubber Soul, the American copy, starting off with I've Just Seen a Face and It's Only Love on side two with only 12 tracks? Or do you feel that it's a better flow of an album with the three tracks, the 14 tracks in England in mono or stereo in the United States? I like both the mono and the stereo copy. I played the stereo copy today, and I sung along with I've Just Seen a Face and It's Only Love and the rest of the album. I even played it in my car today. I played the British version in the car. Um, and here's the mono copy on CD from the Beatles in mono box set, the CD box set. I got such a deal on that box set. I saw it in the record shop. The shrink wrap was taken off of the front of the box. It's on the rest of it, and all of the CDs were all sealed. And it still goes to this day online for over 300, maybe even $500 now. And I got it with all of the CDs sealed inside, virtually, most likely unplayed, for $40. And that's 15 CDs, including the Mono Masters, which has two CDs. Actually, there's more than that because of the White Album. So, no, I believe it's including the White Album. No, if you're counting CDs, there's more. So if it's the White Album on CD, which is mono, and that's great to have. And here is the version that came out of the Capitol years. It has both the mono and stereo American mixes of the album. And this also has the UK. It has the original UK mono mix and the original UK stereo mix. The stereo mix found on the box set uh, LP set that were in stereo. This is taken from a digital master. So what was on the CD version in stereo that was released from the stereo box set is the master tape used on here. This is not analog, whereas this one is analog, and the mono one on here is analog. And I would think that in the stereo one, this is analog. Um, so my question to you is, which do you prefer? Do you like the mono mix with all 14 songs in the UK, or the 12-song mono copy in the United States? Or do you prefer only the UK, the way the Beatles intended them to be? Me, I enjoy both of them. That's my answer to the question. Well, this is Nick the Record Lover. Please subscribe to my page if you like. Leave a comment and like so you'll get more notifications when I make a new video. And December 3rd, 1965 was a great year for music. December 5th, 1965 was a great year for music for us in the United States. Rubber Soul, the Beatles. Take care, guys. Have a great night. And if music be the food of love, play on. Give me excess of it. Good night.